We've been going through the book of Exodus. In fact, we've been going through the whole travel of the Israelites from the time they left Israel this point. And last week we talked about Exodus chapter 34, which was when Moses went up this mountain for the sixth and final time, where he received the second copy of the Ten Commandments, because remember, he destroyed the first copy when he saw the sin of the people as they worshipped idols. So now he has a second copy, and while he was up there, he got to, although it's not enumerated directly in Exodus 34, he got to see the reflection of the glory of God. He couldn't see God's glory directly because none of us can see God's glory and still live. But remember, God put him in the cleft of a rock and covered him with his hand until he had passed by, and then he removed his hand so Moses could see his back, but not his full glory. So Moses went back to the people, but before he did, God made an amazing statement about himself. He gave us a description of who this God we worship really is. He said, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. Well, anyway, after this amazing encounter with Yahweh, Moses headed back down to the children of Israel, and he went back down to the tent of meeting, which is what he had built in between his trips up to the mountain. And that was where he would meet personally with Yahweh. But from chapter 35 on, there is a change of focus in the Bible and in the books here, because now he's going to be talking about the tabernacle, and we'll talk about what is the tabernacle compared to what is the later temple. But the tabernacle, its furnishings, and the Levitical priesthood. Some may ask, well, what do you mean Levitical priesthood? Well, you remember there was one family of Israel's sons called the Levites, the children of Levi, and they were the priestly tribe, so they were referred to as the Levitical priests. There is another priesthood that's talked about in the Old Testament, and that is the Aaronic priesthood, and that refers to Aaron and his descendants. Aaron was the first high priest, and the Aaronic priests were the high priests as time went on. Now, we're not going to go into excruciating detail about all of the furnishings for the tabernacle, and even the tabernacle itself, and all the priesthood. I do want to just fly over at about 40,000 feet and just give you a real snapshot of some of the things that are in there. In chapter 35, it describes the fact that the children of Israel gave freely for the building of the tabernacle. It says that they gave gold, silver, bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet thread, fine linen and goat's hair, ram skins dyed red, badger skins and acacia wood, oil for the light, and spices for the anointing oil, and for the sweet incense, onyx stones, and stones to be set in the ephod and in the breastplate. Well, the first question is, where did they get all of this stuff? Remember, they were slaves. They didn't have any possessions. But you also remember that just after the Passover, as they were getting ready to leave, they were instructed to go to their neighbors and ask for things to take to worship their God. And God opened up the hearts of the Egyptians, and they freely gave to the Israelites. Chapter 36, Moses realized that the people were giving too much, and he had to tell the people, stop giving. I don't think there is a preacher alive today who wouldn't love to be able to be in that predicament, to say to the people, stop giving, you're giving too much. But you know what? we all should be in that position. We all should be in a position where God says, okay, you've given enough, stop giving. He won't tell us that because we don't give too much. But that would be wonderful. So Moses realized that they were giving too much, and he told them to stop giving. And then God gave some special gifts to two men by the name of Bezalel and Oholiab. He gave them gifts of artistry. And these are particular gifts that I envy tremendously because God did not give them to me. Even my stick figures look sickly. Okay, I am not artistic. My son Tim is, and I've known other people who can just take a piece of charcoal and start sketching things out, and before you know it, here's this beautiful picture. I can't do that. But Bezalel and Oholiab were able to do that. Then we get to chapter 37. And you'll notice in your notes there that I've given you pictures of all of these things. I found it personally helpful for me that I could see some of these things as they were being described, so I put them in the notes. Chapter 37 is a description of the Ark of the Covenant. And the word ark literally means a box. There actually are only two occurrences in the Old Testament where a word is translated ark that are different than this. One of them is the ark that Noah and his family were saved in. That's a different word than this. And that same word is used of the basket that Moses was put in when he was a baby to preserve him. And both of those arks were preservation tools. Interestingly enough, the Egyptians used the same word for the sarcophagus of their kings. And you think, well, that sounds strange, that's not preservation, that's death. And yet the Egyptians put them in the sarcophagus along with a whole bunch of items to prepare them and preserve them in the afterlife. So it really has the same meaning. But this ark is a box, and it contains, or later on would contain the Ten Commandments, Moses' rod that budded, and a pot full of manna. On top of the ark was the mercy seat, and that's the platform that had the two cherubim with their wings touching each other. It was between these two cherubim on the mercy seat that God was said to have existed or to have lived. And when the high priest on the Day of Atonement, which was the only time he could go in, when he would go in and place the blood of the sacrifice on the mercy seat, he was offering it to God directly. Now there's also in this chapter a description of the table of showbread. And you see a picture of it there with these round loaves of bread. There are actually 12 loaves, 6 on each side. Why 12? Well, because there were 12 tribes of Israel. And the only ones who were able or permitted to eat these were the priests who worked in the tabernacle, or in this case, the tabernacle, and later in the temple. Also described in this chapter are the lampstand and the altar of incense. The lampstand is the familiar, what we call menorah, with the 7 lamps coming out of it, and there actually were oil lamps on top of each of those arms. And the altar of incense was also described in this chapter. It's interesting that as you go through the book of Revelation, and several times there are scenes in heaven that are depicted, and there is a description of a temple because angels come out of the temple. But the only other thing from the tabernacle or the temple that was described in the book of Revelation is this altar of incense. And in fact, remember, one of the angels took coals from the altar and cast them to the earth, and that was the beginning of the, let's see, I believe that would be the trumpet judgments. Now, the altar of incense, the table of showbread, and the lampstand were all in the holy place of the tabernacle and later the temple. And that was separated from the most holy place by the curtain. Chapter 38 then gives us a description of the altar of sacrifice, which was outside the curtains. And you can see from this picture here, it was described to have 4 horns. There's one horn coming off each corner. The horns were there as an act of mercy. Anyone who was condemned could go to the altar and grab onto the horns and be preserved. There also was the laver, which contained water for cleansing of the priests and of the sacrifice. And chapter 38 also talks about the hangings of the courtyard. And if you read through that, it's really hard to understand exactly what they're talking about. So these pictures here help us see what those hangings might have looked like. It was basically the wall around the courtyard. Then I've given you a picture there that shows the relative position of all of these, from the bronze altar to the laver to the holy place where the showbread and the lampstand and the incense altar, and then the Holy of Holies where the ark is. And if you look at the picture right under that, which is a picture of the temple that was as it was laid out in Jerusalem, you'll see on the left-hand side of that also there's the altar, there is the laver, and then there are the steps, the porch, and the sanctuary, which would be the holy place, and the Holy of Holies, our most holy place. So this tabernacle that was built by the Jews for their travels was an exact image of the temple that would eventually be built. Chapter 39 then contains a description of the priestly garments. The most important thing to notice is the breastplate, which contained 12 precious stones, one for each of the 12 tribes. Chapter 40 describes the setting up of the tabernacle, and this is the last part of the book of Exodus. Then we move into Leviticus. The entire book of Leviticus is focused on the law dealing with the sanctification of Israel through the sacrificial offerings and the festivals. And some of the rabbis used to refer to this book as the law of the priests, or the law of the sacrificial offerings. Typically, Jews referred to this book as Vayikra, which is the first word in that book. In the Septuagint, it's called Leutikon, or as we transliterate it into English, Leviticus. And that's because it deals with the process and duties of the Levitical priesthood. Now, I did mention the Septuagint. Now, a lot of us have a vague understanding of what the Septuagint is. It's one of those ancient documents. But what it is was the first written form of the Old Testament. But it wasn't written in Hebrew, it was written in Greek. And we have Alexander the Great to thank for that, because when he came through and conquered lands, he allowed them to govern themselves and to maintain some of their own religious practices, but he required every land to convert to the Greek language. So at the time that Alexander had conquered the world was a Greek-speaking world. And it was a Greek known as Common Greek. It was what the common people spoke. The word for common in Greek itself is koine. So it's sometimes referred to as Koine Greek. That's the Greek that our New Testament was written in. The Septuagint is the Old Testament version of that. And it was written sometime between the 3rd and 4th centuries before Christ. You say, well, why is that more important than the Hebrew written version? Well, the Hebrew written version wasn't written until between the 6th and 10th centuries AD, or as people in the world today refer to the Common Era, because they don't like to talk about anything having to do with God. So the Septuagint is much older than the Hebrew text, known as the Masoretic text. So the Hebrew, or the Septuagint, is the version that Jesus read from. It's the version that the apostles read from. In fact, when they quote in the New Testament, when they quote Old Testament verses, they're quoting directly from the Septuagint, because that was the only version of the Old Testament that they knew. Now, after the book of Leviticus comes the book of Numbers. It's a little bit unique in that the title is again from the Septuagint, but this title is a translation of a Greek word rather than a transliteration. You say, well, what's the difference? The word Bible is the Greek word biblios, which means a book. That's not a translation, that's a transliteration. It means a word that's taken from one language and brought directly over into another using the letters of their alphabet. So Numbers was, the Greek title was arithmoi, from which we get arithmetic, which has to do with numbers, right? So if it had been transliterated, it would have been arithmus, but it's called Numbers, and we don't know it by any other name today. Had the first two books, Genesis and Exodus, been translated instead of transliterated, they would have been beginnings and escapes. But instead, they're Genesis and Exodus. Now, in the first chapter of the book of Numbers, we have the tribes of Israel are numbered. And this is the first time we're given an exact number of how many of Israelites actually wandered through the wilderness from the Mount Sinai on. Now, that actually was a bit of a misstatement, because it doesn't tell us the number of Israelites. It tells us the number of adult men. Why was it important for them to know the number of adult men and exclude adult women and exclude children? Because in those days when people were numbered, they were counting the number of soldiers or warriors that would go out and fight. Of course, women and children didn't do that, so they just numbered the men. And that's where we see that there were roughly 600,000 Israelite men. And if you assume everyone had a wife, since they're all adult men, and each of them had 3 or 4 children, you can see where it would be 3 or 4 million people that actually left Egypt. Now in chapter 2 of Numbers, the layout of the encampment is given. I put that just so that it's for reference to you. I don't see any great significance in it, but it is kind of interesting to see where the various tribes, clans met around the tabernacle. Chapter 3, the Levites are set aside. Now the Levites weren't numbered in that previous chapter because, remember, they're the priests. They're not going out to war. But now they're numbered, and we have the families of Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, which were the 3 sons of Levi. Now in Numbers chapter 4, we're told that when the Israelites break camp, that Aaron and his sons go in and cover all the furnishings of the sanctuary. Then after they've been covered, the Kohathites come to carry them. The Gershonites carry the curtains and the tabernacle and the hangings of the court, and the Merarites are to carry the boards and sockets. So you see, even the Levitical priests were not permitted to see or touch any of the sacred items when they were traveling. They were hidden from them. Let's skip down to Numbers chapter 7. This is where Moses anointed and consecrated all the furnishings of the tabernacle. And then in Numbers 8, he was given instructions for Aaron for the setting up of the lampstand. In Numbers chapter 9, it says that on the first month of the second year, God instructed Moses to remind the people to keep the Passover at its appointed time. Do we remember when the Passover was? What part of the year? Do you remember after Moses left Pharaoh for the last time, God spoke to him and he said, "This shall be the first of your months. Okay? And he said, on the 10th of the month, you are to select a lamb, and then on the 14th, you are to sacrifice it and paint the doorposts with its blood. So the Passover happened in the first month on the 15th day of the month. What marked the first day of the month? Do you remember? The new moon. The first day the moon was seen to come up by itself, it was considered the first of the month. Now in Numbers chapter 10, it starts out with the description of the making and the use of the 2 silver trumpets. These 2 silver trumpets were used for a couple of things. One, to announce, to gather the people together for war. And that was one type of trumpet sound. Another type was to gather the people together to get ready to move on to the next location. Keep your claws off me, cat. Well, then we learn about Moses' brother-in-law, who's called in some translations his father-in-law, whose name is Hobab. Remember, Reuel was his father-in-law, and we remember also the term in-law was a generic term. So somebody who was a father-in-law was called the same thing as a brother-in-law, who was called the same thing as a son-in-law. It just meant related by marriage. So it's hard to keep straight who these various people were. We do know that Reuel was the father-in-law. And Hobab and there's another one, and I'm forgetting his name right now, who were probably Moses' brothers-in-law. They're the ones that he had to deal with. Okay, so again, that's a 40,000-foot flyover of about 15 or 20 chapters in the Bible. I didn't want to take the time to go through each one of them in depth because, quite honestly, I didn't want to bore you to tears. Now, it's okay being bored to tears with regard to the Bible if it's things that have to do with our daily walk with the Lord. The fact of understanding the daily walk of the Israelites with the Lord is not nearly as important as other things to us. Well, so what? We noted before that the giving of the law on Mount Sinai was a transition point. It changed from, up till then, the Israelites were coming out of Egypt. From that point on, the Israelites were going to the Promised Land. So it's a clear transition between coming out of and going to. But it's also a spiritual transition point. Because you'll notice that up to this point, God has been dealing with the Israelites from a position of grace. As soon as the law came, the Israelites became sinners. And God had to deal with them in a different way. Which is why our belief in the Messiah is so important. Because it changes us the other direction. It changes us from being sinners who are trying to live by the law to those who are saved by grace. And God deals with us graciously rather than legally. Why do you suppose God would show us this miraculous imagery of salvation from the bondage of sin and then portray the rescued Israelites as rebellious, spoiled children, gradually enslaved by the bondage of legalism? Could it be that that's a picture of every one of us? In the past weeks of this study, we've seen the Israelites witnessing numerous miracles of Yahweh. From the miracles that he performed by turning the sea red, by bringing the swarm of locusts and of flies and other plagues on Egypt, to the passing over of the Israelites. Then, as they traveled out of Egypt, God appeared to them, or provided for them at the Red Sea, where he parted the Red Sea and allowed the Israelites to go through, and then destroyed the Egyptians behind them. From that point on, God provided manna every single day, food for the people to eat. He made himself visible in the form of a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The children of Israel saw God perform miracle after miracle after miracle. And finally, on Mount Sinai, they looked up the mountain from the base of it, and they saw the cloud cover the mountain, and they heard the voice of God proclaiming the 10 Commandments to them. The children of Israel saw manifestations of God that we could hope to experience. And yet, as soon as the law was given, they began to turn from God. Why is that? It's because as they learned the law, they learned to rely on the law for their own justification before God. As long as they did everything in the law, they were considered to be just and to be sinless. But we know they weren't. As we started our journey, we began to recognize the way that God was working in our lives, similar to the way he worked in the Israelites' lives. And through faith, we witnessed how much he had already done and how much more he promised to do for us, both in this life and in the eternal promised land. And as Christians, we began to learn about the Bible, and we began to get to know God better because of what's recorded in his Word. We learn to draw closer to our Heavenly Father, and we gain knowledge about how he wants us to live. Now, at some point in our Christian walk, we all learned the rules of Christianity. The more we learn about the rules, the more we take control of our own lives. But the more we control our own lives, the less we rely upon God. I'm going to share a little story, and I hope I don't embarrass anybody, because the person I'm going to talk about is my wife. When we first met, I remember sitting down in the dining room of her parents' home and having a conversation about what makes us a Christian. And she had learned to obey all of the rules of Christianity, and that's what guided her life. But as we sat down and talked about some of these rules, we began to realize that they were somewhat arbitrary, and that it wasn't really the rules that kept us from being sinners. It was our faith in God. The Israelites were the same way. As they learned the rules, they relied on the rules. They didn't rely on God. As we learn the rules to Christianity, we rely on the rules. We go to church every Sunday. We give our tithes and our offering. We support the church by helping work in the church, various functions. And most of us do those things, and that's good. But that's not what God's asking of us. He really is not asking us to attend church every Sunday to make us a better Christian. What happens if we don't do those things is the call of the world gets louder and louder and louder, and the call of faith gets quieter and quieter. We all have to face some point in our life where we see the things of the world and we want them. They're desirous. All that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not from God. That's from Satan. Wanting more stuff, wanting more money, being more important, having more things is not what this life is all about. This life is all about drawing closer to God. Connie was talking about the book, The Attributes of God by Pink. Every other week, the men get together and we go through a chapter in that book, and each time I am amazed at who this God is. This God of ours, not only does he know what we did when we were first born again, he knows what we will do at the end of our life. But more than that, he was there when we first became a Christian. And he is there, not will be, he is there at the end of our life. Because God doesn't just know about all of time, he exists throughout time. He exists throughout time and space. There is no place in space or time where God does not exist right this moment. That's the only reason why he can have prophets predict things in the future that will come to pass. So, there were 2 Jews in all the wanderings here who were allowed to enter the promised land. And of those 600,000 others, how many of them got to enter the promised land? 0. What was it about those 2, Joshua and Caleb? We'll learn in a few weeks that they believed God and they were willing to follow God's leading. It had nothing to do with keeping the law. It had nothing to do with the ritual and the ceremony and the festivals. They all performed those. They all killed the Passover lamb and sprinkled the blood on the doorpost. The thing that allowed Joshua and Caleb to gain God's favor was their faith walk. They never allowed themselves to rely on the ritual and the rules to get them through. They listened to God, and they were willing to follow his direction, even in the face of giants, literally, and insurmountable odds. They had a relationship with God that worked every day. Where are you in your wilderness walk today? Do the things of the world seem attractive to you? Are they things that you want? I can remember when I graduated from high school, there were certain things in my mind that I wanted to acquire. And I figured as soon as I had acquired all of those things that I would be satisfied. Well, fortunately, God got a hold of me before I had to satisfy all those, because they wouldn't have satisfied. So, do you read your Bible regularly? Do you pray without ceasing? Do you give to the church? Do you memorize scripture? Good. If you do, good for you. But do you have peace? Do you wake up each morning knowing that no matter what comes in the day, that you have peace with God? That you have not comfort, but peace. Oh, sure, each day we have challenges. We have to face our own giants. We have to stand up against peer pressure, just like Caleb and Joshua did. But they knew what Paul taught the Colossians. He said, "Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts." Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. One day this life will be over, and we'll have no more opportunities to please God or to prove that we love him. And after this life is over, we Christians will stand before the Bema seat, and we will be rewarded for the things that we did for him. But there will be many who stand before the Bema seat and come away without a crown and only smelling like smoke, because everything that they've done for themselves. But those things will be burned up. Throughout the centuries between the giving of the law and the arrival of the Messiah, the Jewish people had practiced all the rules. They'd performed all the correct rituals, they had observed all the holy days in the prescribed manner, but they had forgotten about their relationship with God, which was based on faith, not on the rules. They became so enslaved to church rules that they couldn't recognize the Messiah, for whom they had been waiting, even when he fulfilled the prophecy by entering the city riding on a donkey. They accused him of claiming to be God. Now, stop and think about that. They were waiting for the Messiah. When the Messiah came, he claimed to be God, and because of that, they crucified him. That doesn't make sense, does it? That's because they were tied to the rules. They weren't living a faith life. Where's your wilderness wandering taking you today? Do you feel lost? Do you thirst for the peace that only God can give? Well, it's not too late. You can cast yourself at his feet right now and confess your selfish, sinful ways. Humble yourself before him, and in his time, he will lift you up. Toss all your worry, your anxieties, your cares on him, because he's already told us he's taking care of you. Not he's going to take care of you, he is taking care of you. Recommit yourself to listening to his still small voice instead of the deafening noise of the world around you. Turn control back to the one who knows the way to do all, and you can bring him the glory and the praise. Do you feel lost? You know you're saved. You know you're going to heaven. But in this world, you feel like you're being torn back and forth. You get disgusted with some of the demonstrations that are going on, with some of the... I'm trying to think of a nice word to describe the mutilation surgeries that are being performed on young children. We see this, and I don't know about you, but it makes me angry. And it makes me want to say, God, when will you come and change all of this? And believe me, it is soon. His coming is very soon. And we need to be ready for him. Let's take a few minutes right now and talk to God about what we want when he comes and what we can do today to gain that. Let's pray.